The sun had not yet broken over Ferrara when the last candle guttered in the ducal apartments, and the air became something you could almost slice beeswax rosewater iron and the faint metallic tang of ink. February 3rd, 1502. On a table by the door, 3 narrow-necked inkwells stood like sentries beside a ledger-bound notary book. A thin door left just shy of closed opened onto the adjoining antechamber, where 3 men waited with quills lifted, heads tilted, and conscience suspended. They were not voyeurs, they were instruments. Their task was to verify what treaties could not guarantee that a marriage had entered the realm of fact. Tonight politics would be written not with pen and seal but with breath and skin and the slow, undeniable grammar of 2 bodies. Inside, Lucrezia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este faced each other across a span of space that felt wider than any battlefield either family had ever crossed. She in white silk shot with gold thread armour of a different order, he with forge-scarred hands and the steadiness of a man who had learned to respect heat. The city slept under winter sky. The cathedral bells had long since finished their iron benedictions, but history in the narrow, airless sense of record was just beginning. By the antechamber door, the papal notary tested his nib against his thumbnail until a crescent of ink darkened the cuticle. The physician summoned from Bologna folded and refolded a square of linen with the compulsion of a man who preferred measurements to mysteries. The 3rd Bernardino secretary to Cardinal Ippolito and the quiet eyes of Isabella d'Este watched the candle flame crawl up the wick and thought not for the first time that human dignity was a fragile varnish, easily blushed, easily scraped. Everyone knew why they were there. A dowry vast enough to fund a war had changed hands. Clauses had been inked in Latin with the calligrapher's curl that disguises a blade. The Borgia name, decadent to some, merely effective to others, was now welded to the house of Este. But as every cardinal, prince and ambassador could have told you, marriage in Christendom was not truly a marriage until it was consummated, and consummation in the hard light of litigation and ambition asked to be proved. So the door stood a finger-width open, so quills hovered, so time bent. Lucrezia stood by the bed and did not tremble. She had learned long ago to suspend the body like a bell between blows. She had also learned the power of performance, not the sham of it, but the discipline. The line of her mouth, the cadence of her breathing, the tone she chose when she turned to Alfonso and said almost conversationally, "We are observed." There was no innocence in the words, but there was no shame either. Just the flat acknowledgement of a currency everyone had agreed to spend. Alfonso, taller than portraits had taught the cities to expect, glanced at the antechamber by reflex, and then back to her, a soldier measuring distance. He had spent years learning how bronze sags toward collapse if overheated, how pressure fails if aimed without account for angle and recoil. He understood the mechanics of endurance. In the door's slice of space, 3 silhouettes shifted. The scratch of a nib began, then paused. He smiled, not bravado, something wryer, and said, "Then let us give them a faithful account. Hey there, before we go on tap, like and subscribe if these stories make you pause, reflect or smile. And now tell me, where in the world are you joining me from tonight? And what hour has history found you at? I want to hear your story." On nights like this, time does not pass. It pools. The first act was not a storm nor a conquest nor a ritual humiliation of the sort whispered in the worst courts. It was a thing meticulously begun, each gesture like the deliberate steps of a craftsman approaching a furnace that could as easily burn as smelt. Outside, the notary recorded what could be recorded, entry interval uttered formulae. The physician listened for the telltale chords of pain or incapacity, and heard instead the unsteady music of cooperation. And Bernardino, obligated to report impressions as well as facts to a woman who made a weapon of her discernment, noticed what everyone else would miss if they only counted the small laugh that escaped either bride or groom. He could not decide which, when a sleeve tangled in a ring, the murmur that sounded not like command and not like plea, but like an instruction 2 conspirators might exchange when working a lock 3 times the Este envoys had insisted. Not once verified, not twice for vigour, but 3 completions squared into certainty, sense hammered into precedent. It was bureaucratic theology at its purest, the kind of arithmetic that comforts the powerful. If 1 witness is good, 3 are better. If 1 seal is sufficient, then thrice sealed is sacred. And so in the ledger on the notary's knee, 3 empty spaces yawned beneath the first line of ink, awaiting their canonical times. Do not make the mistake of assuming no one felt anything. The language of necessity does not banish sensation, it only wraps it in law. Lucrezia, who had played virgin and widow and bride with a competence that had startled Rome into slander, found that competence shifting into something else under this man's sober gaze. He did not gawp or gloat, did not perform the cruelty that lesser men mistake for sovereignty. He asked gently whether she needed anything. She thought of all the things she was never allowed to need, and said instead, "Only this, that we do it together." The word "we" is the smallest lever in politics and sometimes the strongest. He nodded, as if she had confirmed a measurement, and climbed onto a bed that had been blessed 3 times and would be stripped 3 times, and if Rome had its way, would never be truly private again. From the door's thin mouth, the first confirmation came like the click of a lock. A declaration rehearsed in the afternoon, the seal is set, rose formal and faintly absurd through the polished air. The quill recorded the hour. The physician shifted his linen. Bernardino looked at the candle and thought about the difference between a flame and a brand. A servant entered, eyes lowered, collected the sheet with tongs, the way a sacristan might lift a relic, and left behind crisp, hungry white. Theology had met textile, both were satisfied for now. No one pretended the second act would be effortless. Performance exacts its tax. Somewhere between ritual and fatigue, the cadence falters. In the antechamber, the men did not stare at one another. They pretended to be alone, as if privacy might be reconstructed by staring at the floorboards. On the other side of the door, a silver cup clinked, a laugh quicker, now human in the way that can either comfort or wound, carried across the threshold. "They expect theatre," Lucrezia said, not quite teasing. "Be yourself," Alfonso answered, and the physician, who had never liked metaphors, nevertheless wrote a note to himself about respiration patterns that felt to his own hand perilously close to poetry. What is being purchased here? It is the question that hangs above every marriage bed when states are involved. An heir, yes. A clause against future annulments, yes. But there is another commodity less explicit and more durable, the story. The one that will be told in embassies and in kitchens, the one that will continue to work when gold has been spent and treaties frayed. Tonight's story, copied thrice and sealed, would travel farther than any dowry chest because it offered that most seductive assurance immutability. "It is written," men like to say, to which the knight answered with a steadier arrogance, "It is witnessed." By the time the second seal was pronounced, the candle had shortened to a buckled cuff wax, spilling like a scribe's mistake and hardening just as quickly. Bernardino, whose job it was to notice what others refused, found himself admiring against his will the discipline of 2 people who refused to be humiliated by a system designed precisely for that. He would write later that there was nothing obscene in the room except the door itself. Exhaustion has a smell, salt and tallow, and something like metal. Dawn had not yet slit the horizon when the third space in the ledger began to trouble the men like an unpaid debt. 3 is a number with theology behind it and superstition in front. It was not enough politically to obligingly submit. The couple must prove endurance, that flimsiest and most necessary of virtues. In the bedchamber, Alfonso sat at the edge of the mattress and flexed a hand scarred by work most princes leave to those who cannot sign their names. "I'm not sure I can," he said, a sentence more dangerous in this room than any treason. Lucrezia turned his face with 2 fingers as if considering an icon and said in a voice quieter than prayer, "You can. We will." This is the moment that reorders a story. Not the sheets, not the stamps, not the priest's blessing, but the decision inside the machine to retain the word "we." To insist on partnership in a chamber architected for proof and witness, rather than for love, it is how legends slip their leashes. It is how a woman the world had decided to cast as monster or martyr stepped sideways into something less legible and more durable, a strategist who refused to let a mechanism write her entirely. What followed, what will be fully counted and measured in the ledgers of men who loved numbers more than truth, belongs to the next pages. For now, understand the design. The witnesses did not merely hear, they participated in the sacrament they profaned by freezing it into evidence. The bed did not merely support, it transformed into a table where a contract would be negotiated quietly breath by breath. The candles did not simply light. They measured time the way a fuse measures intention. And in the space between the first seal and the last between, we are observed, and we will a theme unfurled like a banner intimacy as theatre. Theatre as governance. Governance as the management of what people will accept as proof. When the third declaration came at last, the seal is set, it sounded less like triumph than like a verdict. Read aloud after a long trial, everyone too tired to cheer. In the antechamber, the notary blew gently on his final line until the ink settled into the parchment's grain. The physician exhaled the sort of breath that tells a man he has been clenching his jaw for hours. Bernardino rubbed his eyes with thumb and forefinger, and against habit let himself think the forbidden thought that there are moments when the human refuses reduction. On his page he wrote a single sentence he would not show Isabella. They did not break. Outside, a faint paling found the eastern windows. Servants went to and fro as they always do, carrying linens that would become exhibits, washing cups that had tasted strategy disguised as wine. Ferrara would wake to bells and laughter and the public story, the feast, the compliments, the procession. But the truer chronicle lay in those 3 lines of the ledger, and in the memory of 2 people who had made a bargain with power and paid in flesh. The city would remember the pageantry, the archives would remember the proof. What survived in the room when the door finally closed and the quills went still was something else, and not tied where law and body met too tight for centuries to loosen. Politics prefers the invisible. It is most comfortable when effects can be felt and causes plausibly denied. Tonight inverted the rule. Cause and effect were made to stand in the same room and nod to 3 men with quills. It is ugly perhaps, it is certainly effective. From the silk-wrapped bed to the cold ledger a path had been laid. Others would walk it, many would bleed on it. The empire of documentation had discovered a sacrament to standardize, and Ferrara had given it a liturgy. But do not mistake the invention for the inventors. 2 people who had more reason than most to despise the stage stood on it and found a way not to be consumed by the applause. When the first bird sang thin and surprised over the palace roofs, the room smelled of spent wax and sweat and something like ironed linen. The door at last shut. 3 signatures would follow triple witnesses stitched into one story. Somewhere a clerk would file the pages between leather boards. Somewhere else a woman would read a report and decide what to do with this new sister-in-law, who refused to be easy. And in the bed, the bride and the groom, no longer metaphors, slept a sleep that owed nothing to poetry and everything to will. It was enough for now to know the shape of the thing that a marriage could be made, visible, and therefore wielded. That a contract could be incarnated and therefore feared. That a private act could be built into a public instrument and still improbably leave 2 human beings intact beneath the instrument's weight. That knowledge would carry them through the mornings, congratulations, the noon rumours, the evening calculations. It would carry them farther than anyone at the door could imagine. The ledger had its 3 lines, history had its hook, and the city had its story to tell about a night when treaties breathed and ink sweated, and power in the ancient way of power asked for proof and was given it. December 1501. Rome was colder than usual that winter, a brittle cold that made even the Vatican's marble corridors feel like mausoleums. The courtyards echoed with the shuffle of clerks carrying ledgers too heavy for their frames, and behind closed doors the currency of dynasties was being counted in gold and flesh. The air inside Pope Alexander VI's chamber smelled of damp wool cloaks, ink, and something sharper, the scent of heated metal as coins were tallied one after another onto wooden tables. Each sound was crisp, final metallic. It was the sound of wealth, but also of burial. Each coin rang like a funeral bell, not only for innocence, but for the illusion that marriage, at least in the higher courts of Europe, was about anything more than arithmetic. 100,000 ducats. The sum was monstrous enough to fund a crusade or bribe a king, enough to build a new cathedral from foundations to dome. To the Este family of Ferrara it was more than temptation. It was insurance against being consumed by larger neighbours Venice, with its claws sunk into the Po Valley. France pressing from the north, the papacy itself looming from the south. To Pope Alexander VI it was a wager that his daughter Lucrezia could cement his dynasty in the heart of Italy through a marriage too gilded for anyone to refuse. The Este envoys robed in sober colours to emphasise their prudence sat across from the Borgia pontiff, who cloaked himself in fatherly composure over papal power. The negotiations were not abstract. They were blunt, transactional, merciless. Goldland exemptions guarantees. The Este men pressed for more than money. They wanted Cento and Pieve fertile lands in Romagna. They wanted trade privileges that would outlast both bride and pope. They wanted papal charters with seals thick enough to withstand generations of lawsuits, and beneath the lists of clauses hovering like incense too thick to ignore lay the unspoken demand proof. Not promises, not notarized contracts, but bodily evidence that Lucrezia could conceive and carry heirs. Their dynasty would not risk extinction for gold alone. The Pope kept his face neutral, but his eyes gave him away sharp flickers of calculation, the faintest pinch of annoyance when the envoys pressed too far. He was a man used to dictating terms not being dictated to, yet he knew the world remembered his daughter's scandals. Twice married, twice discarded. A child of uncertain parentage whispered about in every palace in Italy. To secure Ferrara, he needed to concede more than coin. He needed to offer assurance that could not be faked on parchment. Lucrezia was present in that room, silent but not absent. She stood slightly behind, as was custom, yet the envoys' gazes darted toward her with every turn of the negotiations. She knew it felt the weight of their scrutiny as palpably as if their fingers had pressed into her arm. They were not seeing her as a woman. They were appraising her as one might appraise a horse before a race or a field before harvest. Beauty, yes. Composure, yes. But beneath it all, they wanted utility. Could she bear children? Could she secure a dynasty? Could her body be trusted to do what treaties alone could not? She had been through this twice already. At 13, traded to Giovanni Sforza, she had learned what it meant to be weighed and measured by men who saw her as nothing but contract. At 18, given to Alfonso of Aragon, she had briefly tasted something like love, only to see it choked by political necessity, her husband murdered while she prayed. Now at 22, she understood perfectly love was a mirage. Survival meant learning to negotiate with her own body. When Cardinal Ippolito d'Este leaned forward, his voice deliberate, his words anchored with menace, the air shifted. There must be certainty, he said. The consummation must be witnessed, not merely once, but beyond dispute. The silence that followed was like the drop before an executioner's blade. Even in an age accustomed to witnessed marriages, the detail was stark. They did not trust her name. They did not trust her reputation. They wanted eyes and ears in the bedchamber parchments filled with medical notes and legal seals. They wanted her body audited as if it were a treasury account. Lucrezia did not flinch. Years inside her father's court had taught her the one lesson that kept her alive, the mask, is power. If she showed fear, they would smell blood. If she showed anger, they would label her hysterical. So she kept her face composed, lips curved in the faintest echo of a smile, as if this were no more extraordinary than discussing the size of her dowry chest. Inside, she calculated. If her body must be currency, then she would control the exchange rate. If her privacy must be sacrificed, then she would decide how to choreograph the spectacle. Her father's voice cut across the tension, smooth as silk, yet edged with threat. My daughter's virtue and vigour are beyond question, Alexander VI said. But if Ferrara requires additional assurances, the Holy See is prepared to accommodate. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, additional assurances. Everyone understood what it meant. The Este envoys pressed their advantage and clauses multiplied. The dowry swelled, the lands promised grew, the privileges expanded until the negotiation resembled less a marriage than a treaty after war. And in a way it was. Rome and Ferrara were not allies by affection. They were rivals forced into union, and Lucrezia was the bridge and the battleground. It was close to midnight when Lucrezia finally spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, and unshaken, the voice of someone who had buried husbands, endured rumours, and survived assassins. I accept these terms, she said. Simple words, yet they shifted the room. The envoys exchanged glances. Some were startled by her composure, others impressed. Her acceptance was not submission. It was strategy. She understood what they did not, that consent, even under duress, is still an act of will. By speaking those words herself, she claimed the smallest but sharpest of victory's agency over a bargain already written into her bones. The contracts were signed, the seals pressed into hot wax, the coins locked in iron-bound chests, the territories marked on maps with neat strokes of ink. But everyone knew the true proof would not be weighed until February. When the bedroom doors closed, the witnesses leaned in and Lucrezia's body paid the price that treaties could not. She stood in that Vatican chamber, outwardly serene, inwardly resolved. Let them demand their proofs. She would give them a performance they would never forget. And if her body was to be the coin of the realm, then she would spend it in such a way that no one could mistake who held the power of exchange. In Rome's chronicles, Lucrezia Borgia's reputation was already stained long before she entered the Ferrara negotiations. Her third marriage would be framed not as a hopeful beginning, but as a desperate gamble. To understand why, one must rewind to the ashes of her first two unions alliances that collapsed under the weight of politics and left Lucrezia's name whispered with scandal in every court from Milan to Naples. She was 13 when the first bargain was struck. A girl still more child than woman, draped in cloth of gold and jewels too heavy for her slight frame, she became the bride of Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. The Sforza clan had been a power worth binding to the papacy warriors with Milanese blood, and a proven record of survival in Italy's shifting alliances. For Pope Alexander VI, the match promised leverage. For Giovanni, it promised proximity to Rome's might. For Lucrezia, it promised nothing at all except the sudden transformation from daughter to dynastic pawn. The wedding was as sumptuous as Rome could devise banquets glittering with silver plate choirs chanting Latin, that echoed through the papal halls envoys whispering promises of stability. And then the wedding night. As was customary among nobles, discreet witnesses confirmed consummation. The ritual was observed, the contract sealed, and Lucrezia was declared a proper wife. For 4 years she performed that role with docility, presiding over her household, with grace entertaining ambassadors with studied charm. But Giovanni began to realize that proximity to the Borgias was a poisoned gift. The papal alliances shifted. The Sforza clan ceased to be useful. Giovanni himself became expendable. When Alexander VI moved to dissolve the marriage, Giovanni resisted. To concede would be to admit political defeat. But to defy the Pope was suicidal, so he chose a different weapon: humiliation. Before a papal tribunal, Giovanni declared himself impotent. He swore he had never successfully bedded his wife in 4 years of marriage. The admission was scandalous, shocking, grotesque. In the rigid hierarchy of Renaissance masculinity, to confess impotence was worse than treason. Yet Giovanni preferred to ruin himself rather than let the world say he'd been discarded like refuse by the Borgias. His shame was meant as retaliation. But the trap Giovanni thought he had set for Rome was quietly reversed. Lucrezia, still little more than a teenager, orchestrated her survival with chilling precision. Witnesses were produced to swear to her intact virginity. The annulment went forward, and Giovanni's name was smeared beyond repair. He left Rome a broken man. Lucrezia remained. She had learned a brutal lesson: survival meant weaponizing shame before it could be weaponized against her. If men would treat her body as evidence, then she would decide which evidence survived. 3 years later came her second marriage, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Biscay, a cousin of the King of Naples. The match, celebrated in 1498, promised not only prestige, but for once affection. Unlike the brittle arrangement with Giovanni, this bond seemed genuine. Witnesses recorded tenderness between the 18-year-old bride and her young husband. Their wedding night followed protocol, but beyond the required confirmation they were given privacy, rare mercy in an age when dynasties policed the beds of their heirs. The two fell into something like happiness. Alfonso gave Lucrezia a son, Rodrigo. For a brief season her name was spoken in Rome with less suspicion. The Borgias, it seemed, had given their daughter a chance at love. But politics spares no one. The French advanced into Italy, and the papacy's alliances veered toward them. Alfonso, tied by blood to Naples, became a liability. Cesare Borgia. Lucrezia's brother, cold and relentless, decided that family survival outweighed his sister's joy. Rumours reached the Duke of Danger. In July 1500, assassin struck. Alfonso staggered home from the attack, his doublet soaked in crimson. For weeks, Lucrezia became his guardian. She nursed him with her own hands, slept across his threshold, tasted his food for poison. Observers whispered of her desperate devotion, the transformation from political bride to protective wife. But devotion was no match for political necessity. In August, while Lucrezia attended prayers, the killers returned. This time they finished the work. Alfonso of Aragon died on August 18th. The official story spoke of bandits. Rome laughed at the lie. Everyone knew Cesare had ordered it. Lucrezia emerged from mourning changed. The wide-eyed girl who had once believed in ceremony was gone. The young wife who had briefly believed in love was buried with Alfonso. What remained was a woman who had looked into the abyss of family politics and survived. Her son Rodrigo became her consolation, though even he would be claimed by the fates of dynasties. The court's whispers hardened into legend: Lucrezia, the Black Widow, the pawn who devoured her own husbands. Some painted her as victim, others as conspirator. Neither portrait was whole. What mattered was that her reputation was already in ruins. 2 marriages had ended in public disgrace and blood. Scandal followed her name like a shadow, and yet in the ruins of those unions Lucrezia had forged something her enemies underestimated: resilience. She had endured humiliation without flinching, endured loss without collapse, and emerged with eyes sharper, composure steadier. To the Este family negotiating in 1501 she looked like damaged goods. But damage, as they would learn, can also be strength. In her stillness, in her refusal to be broken, they misread weakness where there was only steel. The bells of Sant'Angelo had hardly ceased tolling for Alfonso of Aragon when Rome began to write Lucrezia's new script. August 1500 had left its stain in marble, and rumour alike, the Duke's body borne through torchlit corridors, the papal court whispering what all already knew, that Cesare Borgia's hand had finished what daggers had begun. In the silence that followed, Lucrezia vanished from public life for weeks, sequestered in grief. Her son Rodrigo clutched to her breast. But when she emerged again, Rome saw not a shattered widow, but something colder, more deliberate, as though the fire had passed through her and hardened her into tempered steel. Love, she understood now, was a luxury her bloodline could not afford. Her first marriage had been annulled on a public stage of humiliation. Her second had been drowned in blood while she prayed. What naive illusions might have clung to her at 13 or 18 were stripped away before her 21st year. What remained was calculation and a resolve that survival demanded performance every bit as artful as ceremony. Rome, for its part, split down familiar lines. Some gossips painted her as pitiable, an innocent woman married off like coin condemned by her own brother's ambition to bury the man she had genuinely loved. They whispered of her devotion in Alfonso's final weeks, how she had nursed his wounds, tasted his food, guarded his chamber with sleepless eyes. To these storytellers, Lucrezia was victim, a fragile rose, trampled under the boots of war. Others saw darker hues. They preferred the tale of the Black Widow, the Borgia siren, whose beauty lured men to their doom. They pointed to the suspicious deaths and the bastard child whispered to be fathered by her brother or her father. They saw not grief but complicity in the calculated silences, the careful withdrawal from scandal when it most threatened her survival. In their telling, Lucrezia was not the mourning widow but the silent executioner's accomplice, her innocence long since bartered away. Neither version contained the whole truth, but both served to make her dangerous. A woman who could survive scandal and bloodshed without collapse was no longer a pawn to be pitied. She was a player who understood the rules. In her silence, Rome saw menace. In her composure, they saw cunning. In her survival, they saw something they neither entirely condemn nor entirely dismiss. And so, when her father began new negotiations, the Este envoys understood what they were acquiring. They were not marrying a maiden whose name was unsullied or whose reputation was untested. They were not even marrying a woman defined by her father's papal tiara. They were marrying a widow reforged in fire, one who had already endured humiliation, loss, and the assassination of her husband at her own family's command. It was not innocence they would find in her chambers. It was resilience, a resilience honed sharp enough to wound if underestimated. For all the ducats that would change hands, for all the clauses written in careful Latin, the true price of alliance with Lucrezia Borgia was that Ferrara must take into its house a woman who had survived Rome. And survival, as she had already learned, is its own kind of power. In the palaces of Ferrara, the Este family polished their lineage like a relic. They traced descent to Charlemagne, boasted centuries of uninterrupted rule, and cultivated an air of refinement that mixed Renaissance brilliance with medieval pride. Their daughters married into Mantua and Milan. Their sons filled bishoprics and courts. But among them was one heir who preferred the clang of iron to the honey of courtly verse, Alfonso di Este, born in 1476, a man whose destiny was written not in poetry but in powder. Unlike most princes, Alfonso spent his hours not in salons or ballrooms, but in the forges of Ferrara. He loved the smell of coal dust and the roar of furnaces, where bronze glowed like captive suns before being hammered into form. He worked side by side with blacksmithers and gunners, scarred his hands on cooling metal, and tested designs that married physics to destruction. His passion was artillery cannons capable of battering walls thought impregnable culverins that could extend reach across fields and rivers. Where his peers scribbled sonnets to their mistresses, Alfonso sketched firing angles and recoil calculations. War to him was a problem of trajectory and leverage. This devotion gave him a reputation that was both unsettling and oddly reassuring. He was practical, unromantic, and disarmingly direct. He spoke less of ideals than of measurements, less of destiny than of capacity. He valued what could be forged, tested, proven. In a world of courts drowning in flattery, his plainness could be mistaken for brusqueness. Yet those who served with him learned to trust it. Steel did not lie. Neither, it seemed, did Alfonso. His family, however, bristled when Rome suggested his marriage to Lucrezia Borgia. To them, the Borgias were upstart Spaniards who had clawed their way into the papacy with gold and rumour leaving trails of poison and scandal. Isabella d'Este. Alfonso's formidable sister wrote letters dripping with disdain. Why should Ferrara, with its noble heritage, admit into its house a woman whose name was synonymous with corruption? Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, another brother, schemed for alternatives, imagining alliances more fitting to their pride. The match to them was an insult dressed in gold thread. But Alfonso looked at the matter differently. To him, marriage was not poetry, nor was it lineage spun into silk. It was trajectory. He studied the geopolitical map as he would a fortress wall. Venice pressed from the east. France threatened from the north. The Papal States wielded by Alexander VI controlled the south. Ferrara, a jewel of culture and fortification, could not afford isolation. The Borgias offered protection, papal favour, and a dowry vast enough to fill arsenals with cannon. Alfonso approached the marriage like an engineering problem. Identify the forces, measure the risks, calculate the necessary reinforcements. Yes, the bride was infamous. Yes, the Borgias were feared and despised. But gold was gold and papal support was papal support. To a man who understood that trajectories decide sieges, the path was clear. Better to endure whispers in the salons than to face the silence of broken walls when enemies arrived. So when his family recoiled, Alfonso simply nodded. No poetry, no protestations of duty, no lament over scandal. He read the contract as if it were artillery specifications, and when he was told of the unusual consummation requirements, the triple proof demanded by Ferrara, he accepted them with the same blunt composure. If it must be done, it will be done, a statement less of romance than of logistics. It was this quality pragmatism, shorn of vanity, that would make him a strange match for Lucrezia. Where others saw in her only scandal, he would see a woman who had endured and survived much as he admired metals tempered in fire. Where others shuddered at the Borgia stain, he calculated only angles and outcomes. Alfonso d'Este was no poet, but sometimes in a world that valued masks and illusion, the bluntness of an engineer was the most dangerous poetry of all. The letters that passed between Rome and Ferrara in the winter of 1501 read less like courtship than like military dispatches. The Este envoys sent demands itemized with the severity of quartermasters' lands, gold privileges, and most striking of all conditions regarding the wedding night. And in Ferrara, Alfonso d'Este read them not as a husband-to-be, but as an engineer facing specifications. Where another groom might have flushed with embarrassment or sputtered with outrage, Alfonso simply took up a quill and made notes in the margin. Position, timing, verification. To him it was not intimacy, it was logistics. The irony was bitter. Alfonso had already endured one annulled marriage, a short-lived union with Anna Sforza that collapsed under the accusation of non-consummation. Whether the failure lay in Alfonso's youth, Anna's illness, or sheer political expedience, the stain lingered. In courts where lineage mattered more than truth, whispers about impotence clung like smoke. The Este family had fought to bury the scandal, but Alfonso remembered. He knew how swiftly dynasties could be undermined by the simple claim that a bed had stayed cold. Now fate had placed him opposite Lucrezia Borgia, whose 2 previous marriages had ended in equal scandal, one in a husband's humiliation, the other in a husband's blood. 2 damaged reputations meeting in the fragile theatre of a wedding bed, every whisper of failure waiting to be weaponized. It was precisely that memory which made Alfonso so meticulous. The Este family demanded proof beyond dispute. Not one act easily contested or forgotten, but 3. 3 consummations observed, recorded, notarized. The number was no accident. 3 was the number of certainty, the number that silenced doubters and buried counterclaims. A ledger with 3 entries could withstand the most venomous tribunal. Alfonso recognized the logic immediately. In artillery design, 1 test shot proves possibility, 2 prove consistency, 3 prove reliability. He approached the requirement the same way. Thus, the protocols were drafted with the precision of siege plans. Witnesses were to be positioned in an adjoining chamber door cracked wide enough for sound, narrow enough to feign dignity. Candles placed at calculated angles ensuring movement could be discerned in shadow if more than sound was needed. Fresh linens prepared in triplicate to be removed and examined after each act like evidence from a battlefield. A physician on hand to note respiration, vocalization, the telltale marks of effort. A notary to fix times in ink. And Bernardino the spy in Isabella d'Este's service to carry gossip back to Mantua, like a blade hidden in parchment. To most men, such arrangements would have felt like degradation. But Alfonso's mind, trained to translate chaos into function, saw them as tolerable. If this was the price of alliance, then it would be paid with the same dispassion as smelting ore or calibrating cannon barrels. Once proves capacity, he remarked to a counsellor. Twice proves vigour, thrice leaves no doubt. His words recorded in Este archives carried no romance but plenty of resolve. What he did not yet realise, what neither side fully accounted for, was that Lucrezia herself had learned to weaponize these rituals. She understood that if her body was to be treated as contract, then she would perform with such control that even witnesses would be forced to acknowledge her mastery. Alfonso, with his forge-born pragmatism, and Lucrezia, with her survival-honed composure, were about to turn a humiliating demand into a demonstration of power. For now, though, the plans lay on parchment, every detail catalogued, every contingency prepared. It was less a wedding than a campaign, and in February the battle would be fought not with swords or cannons, but with endurance documentation and 3 unassailable proofs inked into history. The Bentivoglio Palace in Bologna was chosen with care. Neutral ground halfway between Ferrara and Rome, it stood as a compromise between 2 dynasties who trusted neither the other's halls nor their own shadows. On January 30th, 1502, its torchlit chambers became the stage for a meeting intended to be courteous, formal and forgettable. A bride and groom introduced just days before their binding. Instead, what happened there unsettled every calculation. Lucrezia Borgia arrived first, dressed not in the dazzling cloth of gold that her father's courtiers urged upon her, but in velvet the colour of ripe mulberries. Burgundy instead of brilliance, mature measured a statement. Her hair, still her finest weapon, was bound with restraint, only a few strands catching the winter light that angled through the palace windows. She knew eyes would search for scandal in her every detail. She meant to give them poise instead. She stood near a casement so the natural light would catch her face, not the torch flames that exaggerated shadows. It was a choice both theatrical and tactical. Alfonso entered with less ceremony. He did not bow with flourish or reach for elegant words. He simply stopped when he saw her. Taller than she expected, broader across the shoulders, his hands bore the sewn scars of forge work, raw and princely honest. The silence between them held for 3 heartbeats, enough for everyone present to feel its weight. Then Lucrezia smiled, not the practiced court smile polished through years of Vatican intrigue, but something smaller, genuine, almost surprised. "You are not what I expected," Alfonso said at last. The script should have demanded flattery. He should have praised her beauty, her virtue, her piety. Instead, he gave her honesty, and she laughed. The sound startled even her ladies. "Neither are you," she answered. And with that exchange, the brittle ice of ceremony cracked. For the next 3 hours, they spoke with a candour that alarmed every observer. Alfonso described his cannon designs, his experiments in metallurgy, the joy he took in hammering glowing bronze into form. Lucrezia confessed her weariness with endless pageantry, the suffocating theatre of courts, where every gesture was monitored for treachery. He showed her his hands seamed with burn scars, proof that he laboured beside smiths, rather than merely commissioning them. She in turn spoke of surviving 2 marriages that had been less unions than executions of political will. "I have been a wife," she said, "but never truly a partner. It was dangerous talk. Political marriages were not meant to harbour honesty. They were meant to preserve masks, not discard them. Yet here in a palace that had seen its share of betrayals, 2 people momentarily set theirs aside. Cardinal Ippolito d'Este lingered in the doorway, his clerical robe a curtain for his dismay. He had expected his brother to endure the meeting with dutiful stoicism to show the Borgia bride the courtesy owed by politics, but nothing more. Instead, he saw Alfonso engaged, even animated, leaning forward when she spoke, answering her with laughter that echoed across the chamber. Ippolito's letters later dripped with unease. They find each other tolerable, worse perhaps desirable. What was meant as transaction may ripen into attachment. The greatest threat to political machinery is always the unplanned variable of genuine human connection. If bride and groom began to desire each other, it would make the required public performance easier. Bodies obey more readily when attraction is real, but it also made it infinitely more perilous. A marriage that carried affection could generate loyalties stronger than clauses, affections that outlived treaties, choices that defied calculation. When their conversation strayed to the unusual consummation requirements, Lucrezia did not blush or demur. 3 times she asked plainly, her tone threaded with dry humour. Alfonso nodded unashamed. 3, he said as though reciting an equation. She tilted her head, met his gaze directly. Then we had better like each other. Witnesses swore they saw him smile in answer, not courtly, not cruel, but as if conceding to an ally. By the time the meeting ended, the air itself felt altered. What had begun as a diplomatic formality had swerved into dangerous terrain. 2 reputations ruined in different ways, hers by scandal, his by annulment, had found recognition in each other. What others viewed as liabilities they saw as familiarity. When they parted, Alfonso lifted her hand, not to kiss in the ceremonial gesture, but to turn it palm upward, examining it like steel. Soft, he said, quietly but tempered. Lucrezia traced one of the burn scars across his knuckle. We all bear the marks of our work, she answered. Their fingers lingered too long before parting. For everyone else, the meeting was cause for alarm. Genuine rapport had slipped into a marriage designed to be mechanical, and nothing complicates politics more than the possibility of desire. The morning of February 2nd, 1502, dawned with a cruel irony. Across Christendom, the feast of the Purification of the Virgin was celebrated with hymns and candlelight, Mary's sanctity honoured, her obedience exalted. In Ferrara, the bells pealed for a different kind of purity, one that would be tested not by prayer but by performance. On this day, Lucrezia Borgia would walk the aisle, not as a maiden reborn, but as a woman whose past had been written in annulments, blood and rumour. And yet she was dressed as the Church's most radiant symbol, the Virgin Bride. The cathedral brimmed with power. Nobles packed the pews in brocade and furs, their whispers trailing like incense. Foreign ambassadors studied every detail, measuring prestige as carefully as they did dowries. In the front, Estamen, stiff with pride, sat opposite papal envoys shimmering in scarlet, each zone watching for the faintest tremor of weakness. The high altar groaned under gold candlesticks. Reliquaries glittered with gems, and behind it all loomed the frescoes of saints whose gazes seemed both blessing and accusation. Into this theatre came Alfonso d'Este, dressed not in ceremonial silks, but in armour. Polished steel, functional, unapologetic. It was an announcement this marriage was not sentiment, it was fortification. He looked less like a bridegroom than a commander at the threshold of campaign. And following him, Lucrezia, arrayed in white silk embroidered with gold thread so fine that each step caught the light like the glint of swords. Pearls bound her famous hair, cascading like chains made radiant. She was no blushing maiden, she was a weapon wrapped in sanctity. The ceremony unfolded with ritual solemnity, but every prayer seemed doubled in meaning. When Cardinal Ippolito d'Este intoned, "Let this union be fruitful," the congregation heard not only the language of sacrament, but the language of heirs. When he prayed, "May God bless this sacred bond," everyone understood the bond would not be judged sacred until witnessed bodies confirmed it. The gospel spoke of covenant, but the court whispered of contracts. Then came the homily. Ippolito, robed in red that shimmered like blood under the high windows, lifted his voice in a sermon that touched the edge of blasphemy. He spoke of Mary as the vessel chosen for God's will, of women's bodies as instruments through which divine plans are made flesh. His gaze fell deliberately on Lucrezia. The subtext was merciless. Tonight her body would be vessel not of God but of dynastic necessity. Her sacrifice was not virginal purity but endurance under the eyes of men with quills. Every noble in the cathedral understood the sermon's implication. Every line of Latin dripped with the unspoken knowledge that the true marriage would not be concluded at this altar, but in a chamber stripped of privacy. The exchange of rings was performed with military precision. Alfonso's hand, seamed with scars from years at the forge, slid gold onto her finger without hesitation. Lucrezia reciprocated, though observers noted the faint tremor in her hand. Whether from nerves' fury or the crushing weight of expectation, no one could tell. When their lips met in the ritual kiss, it was brief, controlled, and correct. The real seal everyone knew awaited midnight. Around them, Ferrara celebrated. Trumpets blared, feasts were prepared, and courtiers congratulated themselves on the alliance. But beneath the laughter unease gnawed. The wedding had been staged as sacred pageant cloaked in hymns and relics, yet the true stage was elsewhere, waiting in candlelight and linen. There, beneath the echo of this day's sermons, flesh would become contract and history would be written not in scripture but in sweat and ink. For now the city cheered its new duchess, radiant in gold and silk, and its duke armoured like a general. But everyone present knew the truth. This union would be remembered not for its vows before God, but for what followed when God's priests had left the room. The feast had dwindled into drunken laughter. The cathedral's incense faded into memory, and Ferrara's palace corridors grew hushed. Yet behind one heavy oak door, the true marriage preparations were only beginning. The bedchamber, normally a place of intimacy, had been stripped of that sanctity and remade into something colder, a stage for verification. Every object in the room bore double meaning. Candles stood not for romance, but illumination of movements. Crisp sheets weighted like legal parchment destined to become exhibits. Even the bed itself, draped in embroidered coverlets, had been blessed not once but 3 times, as though layers of prayer could sanctify what would unfold. In the adjoining chamber 3 men gathered, summoned less as guardians of propriety than as custodians of doubt. First came Francesco Castello, papal notary. His hands' ink stained his face, a mask of weary neutrality. Before him lay 3 prepared parchments, each sealed in advance, awaiting only the precise entries that would prove what no contract alone could secure. His task was simple but absolute: record times, record acts affix his seal. His words would outlast memory, and should disputes arise years later, his script would be invoked like gospel. Beside him stood Ludovico Cari, physician from Bologna, carrying not only his medical texts, but the peculiar detachment of a man accustomed to reducing human mysteries into clinical observations. He was to note signs of successful consummation, the bride's cries, the groom's exertions, the stains upon the sheets, even the odour of bodies spent. Where Castello provided legality, Cari would provide biology, lending the authority of science, if one could call it such, in 1502 to the theatre of sex. The third presence was most unnerving, Bernardino da Prosperi, secretary to Cardinal Ippolito, an informant for Isabella d'Este, Alfonso's formidable sister. Unlike the others, he was not there to certify the alliance, but to spy upon it. His eyes were trained to detect subtleties, whether Alfonso's vigour was duty or genuine desire, whether Lucrezia's composure concealed distaste or attraction. His report would not be filed in Ferrara's archives, but carried privately to Mantua, where Isabella would savour every detail as ammunition for the endless rivalries between sisters-in-law. Their tools lay ready. The notary's quills, sharpened and tested, rested in ink that gleamed like black mirrors. The physician had clean linens folded for examination, vials of herbs to revive exhaustion if necessary. Bernardino carried only his memory and a poisoned pen more dangerous than any scalpel. They arranged themselves in the antechamber. The door left a careful finger-width open enough for sound, enough for shadow, but narrow enough to preserve the bare pretence of privacy. The transformation was complete. What should have been a sanctuary for bride and groom had been recast as a medical theatre. The Este family's paranoia demanded it. Alfonso's first marriage had collapsed on the grounds of non-consummation. Giovanni Sforza had humiliated himself with public claims of impotence. Rome's courts had long memories of annulments of alliances unravelling because someone whispered that a bed had been cold. The Borgias too had their own scandals of mysterious children and whispered incest. Neither house could afford ambiguity, and so the palace chamber became a tribunal of flesh. Every sigh would be documented, every gasp would be interpreted, sheets would be inspected like relics. Human intimacy was reduced to evidence. 3 witnesses, 3 sets of responsibilities, 3 overlapping shadow toes stretching into the bedchamber. The Este family demanded certainty, and certainty they believed could only be forged under watchful eyes. Beyond the door, the voices of revellers faded into silence. Midnight approached. The bride and groom would enter soon, and with them the weight of generations determined to prove beyond doubt that what transpired was not love, not even marriage, but strategy incarnated in flesh. Midnight. The cathedral bells had long since gone silent, leaving only the muffled crackle of torches and the hush of waiting servants in the corridors. Behind the carved oak door of the ducal chamber, history held its breath. Lucrezia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este stepped into a room already stripped of intimacy, remade into tribunal. The linens were freshly turned, the bed blessed 3 times, the candles arranged for shadow no more than light. In the adjoining antechamber, 3 men leaned toward the sliver of space left at the door, ears sharpened, quills poised. The silence between bride and groom stretched taut before breaking. Alfonso's voice came first, low but clear enough for the listeners. "I am sorry for this necessity. Not the words of conquest, not the bravado of a man proving himself, but the flat honesty of someone who knew he was being measured." Lucrezia's answer carried steel under silk. "We are instruments tonight. Let us at least play in harmony." At that, one of the witnesses coughed to mask his discomfort, and Costello the notary set his quill to parchment. At midnight the parties entered the chamber, both in sound health. Then the bed creaked, cloth rustled, a breath hers or his caught in the air, followed by a muffled laugh, astonishing in its tenderness. Dr. Carey the physician bent closer, ears pricked for signs of distress. He expected protest pain, the brittle cries of a woman performing chastity. Instead, he heard murmured words too low for transcription, punctuated by steady rhythms that grew more certain as minutes passed. He scribbled in the margin, proceedings vigorous. Bride responsive, groom steady. Bernardino Isabella d'Este's spy noted something different. He saw the silhouettes shift in candlelight movements, not purely mechanical but oddly cooperative. He wrote later to his mistress that her brother seemed less executioner than partner, and that Lucrezia, despite the humiliation of scrutiny, carried herself with composure, perhaps even agency. For him, the shock was not that consummation occurred, but that it unfolded with unexpected gentleness. The sounds reached their first crescendo around the 20-minute mark. The bed groaned, a final sharp intake of breath cut the air, and then silence, heavy as stone. In that silence, Alfonso's voice, formal and deliberate, carried through the door. "The first seal is set." Costello's quill scraped furiously. He wrote the words in thick black strokes, sealing them with the authority of the papal notary. Servants entered quickly, eyes lowered, their hands rehearsed. The sheets were gathered with reverence, folded as though they were relics. Spots of blood strategically placed by Lucrezia's ladies with poultry sacrifice earlier that day marked the linen. Whether anyone believed it genuine was irrelevant. Symbols carry their own truth, and these stains were enough to satisfy any future tribunal. Carey examined them with professional detachment, noting the presence of what he called sanguine tokens, and declaring the act sufficiently proven. Fresh linens were laid, candles trimmed, wine poured. The couple remained on the bed, speaking too softly for the witnesses to hear. But Bernardino swore he caught fragments of laughter, a tone shockingly out of place in a room meant for humiliation. He would later describe it as a conspiracy of 2 against the eyes upon them. The first act was complete. The legal seal affixed the medical proof, gathered the symbolic blood preserved. For most marriages it would have been enough, but for Lucrezia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este, 1 act was only the beginning. 2 more lines gaped empty on the notary's parchment. The night was far from over. The first linens had scarcely been carried away when silence thickened again in the chamber. Midnight was long gone. The feast's embers had cooled, but the real ordeal was only beginning. For most noble unions, a single act sufficed marriage, proven alliance secure. But the Este contract demanded more. Twice would prove vigour, 3 times would silence any tribunal. The witnesses in the antechamber knew it, and so did the couple behind the bed curtains. Alfonso sat at the edge of the mattress, chest rising, heavily shoulders damp with sweat. He had fought sieges with less strain than this ritual, and the absurdity of it weighed on him. "They will expect more," Lucrezia said quietly. Her tone was not reproach, but matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who had lived her whole life under conditions written by men who would never pay their price. Alfonso managed a thin laugh. They expect cannons to reload themselves too. Wine was poured, herbs mixed in for strength. Lucrezia pressed the cup to his lips, and for a moment the scene looked less like political theatre than like a wife tending a weary husband. The witnesses heard the clink of metal, the low murmur of encouragement. Then came the slow rustle of repositioning, the awkward shuffle of limbs, weary but unwilling to concede. Fatigue made clumsiness inevitable. A sleeve snagged on a candlestick, sending wax sputtering onto the floor. Alfonso cursed under his breath. Lucrezia stifled a laugh that turned into something contagious. Even the men at the door could hear it, a ripple of humour that undermined the solemnity of their task. Bernardino's quill scratched furiously, noting for Isabella that her brother's bride seemed unafraid, even playful, turning ordeal into partnership. The second attempt lacked the careful ceremony of the first. It was slower to begin, faltering at intervals. Alfonso's breathing grew ragged. Twice he stopped altogether, shoulders heaving as though he had struck against some invisible wall. But each time Lucrezia steadied him, not as victim, but as collaborator. Halfway to freedom, she whispered once, the words carrying just enough to reach the listeners beyond the door. It was encouragement wrapped in defiance. What followed bore less resemblance to performance than to cooperation. Adjustments were made, with murmured consultation positions altered, not for spectacle but for endurance. At one point a water pitcher overturned clattering to the floor with a splash that sent servants scurrying. The chamber smelled now of spilt wine, sweat, and stubborn determination. Through it all, laughter returned, brief, suppressed, but unmistakably human. Time stretched strangely. To the witnesses, minutes dragged as they strained to distinguish evidence from irrelevance. To the couple, exhaustion blurred moments into one long trial. Yet eventually the rhythm steadied. Alfonso found his breath again. Lucrezia matched him with murmured cues. And when at last the climax arrived, it was not he who spoke, but she, voice clear-edged with triumph. "The second seal is set, my lords." Costello recorded the phrase at once, his script less elegant now, betraying his own fatigue. Carrie examined the new linens with the same clinical detachment, though the blood trick from the first act could not be repeated. Still, the evidence was deemed sufficiently vigorous. Bernardino, more poet than clerk, wrote privately that the ordeal seemed less a spectacle of domination than a collaboration of survivors. In the antechamber, quills dried in their inkwells as the men exchanged uneasy glances. They had been called to verify submission, but what they were hearing sounded unsettlingly like partnership. By the time the second set of linens had been carried away, dawn was already nudging at the horizon. The torches guttered low, their smoke mixing with the heavy scents of sweat wine and spilt wax. In the bedchamber, two figures lay in silence, bodies slack with fatigue, chests rising and falling as though they had fought a campaign. For most marriages, it would have ended there, duty satisfied, alliance secured, but not for this one. The Esther contract demanded a third proof, the number of completion, the trinity of certainty. And so in the hours before sunrise they faced what seemed impossible. Alfonso sat hunched, elbows on his knees, face shadowed by exhaustion. His forge-scarred hands trembled not from fear but from sheer depletion. "I cannot," he muttered, voice rough, almost broken. "Not again." It was a dangerous admission, one that could unravel months of negotiation if it reached the wrong ears. On the other side of the door, the witnesses shifted quills, poised to record failure as readily as success. Lucrezia turned toward him, her eyes steady despite the hollowness in her own limbs. She had buried one husband, humiliated another husband, murdered. She would not allow this man to fail from mere fatigue. Reaching across the rumpled sheets, she touched his face with a hand that trembled, but did not waver. "You can," she said, her voice soft yet unyielding. "We have come too far. We will finish this together." It was not romance. It was resolve. The woman who had endured annulment and assassination understood better than anyone that survival was measured not in tenderness but in endurance. Alfonso lifted his head, eyes bloodshot, and managed a tired smile. "You speak like a general," he said. She answered, "Then march." The third attempt was stripped of ceremony. No careful pacing, no deliberate gentleness. It was a raw act of necessity fueled by stubbornness and the knowledge that failure would echo in tribunals for generations. Their movements were halting, laboured, punctuated by gasps that sounded more like effort than passion. Yet within the strain something unexpected flickered laughter. When Alfonso knocked over a candlestick, nearly setting a pillow smouldering, Lucrezia burst into quiet hysterics. He joined her, the sound ragged, half mad with fatigue. "Every ducat of my dowry must be earned tonight," she joked. Alfonso, breathless, replied, "Cannons require less careful aim." Even the witnesses, straining to maintain detachment, glanced at one another in disbelief. Still the ordeal dragged on. Costello's parchment bore the blunt line, "Third attempt begun near dawn," both parties persevering despite evident exhaustion. The physician frowned, scribbling notes about risks of overexertion, muttering that such trials could damage fertility. But politics had no patience for medicine. Bernardino the spy noted something else entirely, that the two seemed to draw strength not from duty but from each other, a partnership forged in extremity. At last, near 6 o'clock, as the first grey light crept through the shutters, the ordeal ended. Alfonso's voice, barely audible, rasped the words, "The third seal is wert." And then, astonishingly, Lucrezia repeated it louder, with clarity meant for every ear beyond the door, "The Borgia promise is fulfilled. Let no one doubt Esther Vigor or Borgia determination." Silence followed, deep and stunned. Then, against all protocol, Bernardino began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, then joined by the others in applause both absurd and strangely human, acknowledging not passion, not love, but sheer endurance. Servants crept in to remove the final sheets damp with sweat and effort, less dramatic than the first, but enough to satisfy law. Costello sealed the last parchment. Carrie wrote his final clinical notes. Bernardino, still shaken, prepared the report that would astonish Isabella d'Este. Not humiliation, but partnership. The chamber fell quiet at last. The couple lay entwined, too tired to move, too stubborn to release each other. Outside, the sun rose over Ferrare, gilding the city in pale light. The impossible had been achieved. 3 seals, 3 proofs, 3 acts documented and preserved. And with them a marriage hammered into permanence not by love alone, but by endurance paid in full, September 1502. The palace bells that had once rung for triumph now tolled in anxious rhythm. 7 months after the wedding night that had become legend, Lucrezia Borgia lay in the birthing chamber, her body racked by labour that stretched into agony. The women around her worked in grim silence, midwives passing cloths already soaked, crimson physicians muttering prayers as though medicine and miracle might blend into salvation. Outside the chamber, courtiers waited with forced cheer, pretending not to hear the muffled cries that seeped beneath the door. At last a child was delivered, a girl, small and frail. She was baptized within hours, given a name that would outlive her body by only days. The infant's breath faltered, her life extinguished before it had truly begun. In Ferrara, the rejoicing that had accompanied the February alliance curdled into whispers. What worth was a duchess who bore only a dying child? What use was a marriage sealed with such spectacle if its fruit withered in the cradle? But the greater peril was to Lucrezia herself. She bled relentlessly, her body refusing to heal. Fever swept over her, dragging her between delirium and silence. For 2 weeks she hovered near death, her attendants crossing themselves each time her breath stilled for too long. Alfonso haunted the chamber door, the practical engineer undone by helplessness. He could design cannons to breach walls, but no weapon could silence the slow seep of blood from his wife's body. The physicians whispered in corners as their tones hushed but urgent. Some dared to voice what many suspected, that the triple consummation had exacted its price. 3 acts in one night demanded by paranoia, and performed against exhaustion, may have torn more than pride. The proof that had secured her marriage might have damaged the very body meant to bear heirs. It was a cruel symmetry. The night that had guaranteed her position might also deny her its purpose. Yet survival was a language Lucrezia spoke fluently. She had lived through annulment, through assassination, through scandal that would have crushed others. She endured again, now clinging to life with the same iron will that had carried her through the gaze of witnesses in that midnight chamber. On September 20th, her fever broke. Her eyes cleared, and her first words were chilling in their clarity. Did the documentation reach Rome? Even on the edge of death, she thought not of the lost child or her own fragile body, but of politics. Proof of alliance, permanence, her survival had meaning only if the world knew the contract held. The baby was gone, her body bore new scars, but Lucrezia lived. Once more she emerged from blood and loss, reshaped, not broken. Resilience had become her sharpest weapon, and it would serve her longer than youth or beauty ever could. The Duchess of Ferrara had paid her blood price, and she had survived again. The scandal of Ferrara did not remain contained within its walls. News travels fastest when it is whispered, and by autumn of 1502 courts across Italy were already murmuring, about the night Lucrezia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este endured under watchful eyes. The story was retold with flourishes, 3 witnesses sworn, 3 seals proclaimed, 3 linens stained and stored like relics. What had begun as nest of precaution soon acquired a name half mocking, half reverent, the Borgia Protocol. Within months it spread like wildfire through the corridors of power. Other noble families, fearful of annulments and humiliated by rumours of impotence, seized upon the idea. In France, envoys scribbled clauses demanding ocular and auditory confirmation. In the German principalities, bishops began drafting guidelines for sufficient proof of consummation. Even in Spain, whispers suggested that certain alliances would henceforth be sealed not only before God, but before witnesses armed with quills and candles. The effect was insidious. What had once been rare and extraordinary, a witnessed bedding to settle disputes, hardened into expectation. Marriage contracts grew longer, clauses more explicit. Some courts required notaries alone, others added physicians. Still others demanded servants to handle and seal the sheets. Intimacy became a form of bureaucracy, love reduced to procedure. Where once treaties were signed with ink and wax, now bodies themselves bore the burden of validation. For Lucrezia, the irony was bitter. She had been forced into the ritual by suspicion, yet her endurance transformed it into precedent. What should have been humiliation became a template. The night that nearly broke her body became the standard by which others were judged. Noble brides from Prague to Paris were told, sometimes gently, sometimes brutally, that their wedding nights would be observed. Grooms were reminded that vigour was not private performance but public duty. The language of contracts shifted accordingly. Words like sufficient consummation and verifiable union appeared in parchment clauses, alongside lists of dowries and territorial exchanges. Lawyers pored over sheets as though they were maps of conquered lands. Physicians wrote treatises on the physical signs of successful intercourse, their language clinical, but their purpose political. And with each repetition the line between sacred and profane blurred further. Churchmen who once preached the sanctity of the marriage bed now sanctioned its exposure. Priests blessed sheets as if they were relics, even as they reeked of sweat and staged blood. Courtiers began to joke that contracts were not valid until moans were notarized. Behind the laughter, unease simmered an awareness that something deeply human had been surrendered. This was the legacy of Ferrara, the systematization of intimacy. What had been whispered in scandal became ritual in policy. The Borgia Protocol turned bedrooms into courtrooms, passion into precedent, flesh into contract, and in doing so it permanently altered the architecture of dynastic power. By 1503, Lucrezia had recovered enough from childbirth to resume her role in Ferrara's intricate dance of politics, but she had also learned a lesson no priest or ambassador had ever intended to teach her: intimacy, when documented, was a weapon. The night of triple consummation had shown her that sex could be transformed into archive, that desire, whether genuine or feigned, could be notarized, whispered and wielded like steel. Now she would turn that lesson outward. Her chosen target was audacious Francesco Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, and husband of Isabella d'Este, Alfonso's proud and ruthless sister. Isabella had long despised Lucrezia, sneering at her reputation, mocking her scandals, and planting Bernardino de Prosperi in the bedchamber itself to spy on her humiliation. If Isabella believed that surveillance granted her power, Lucrezia would demonstrate the opposite, that secrets cut both ways. The affair with Francesco began with the precision of a campaign. Meetings were orchestrated under the guise of diplomacy, exchanges of gifts arranged so that discovery was inevitable, not accidental. Love letters were crafted not only to inflame but to incriminate. Where Isabella had once ordered Prosper to record every gasp of her brother's wedding night, Lucrezia now ensured that Francesco's words, scrawled in his own hand, would reach Isabella's eyes at the most destabilizing moments. The timing was merciless. A love token revealed during delicate negotiations, a whispered rumour surfacing just as Isabella sought to assert dominance in family councils, a letter conveniently misplaced that forced Mantua's courtiers to reckon with their lord's wandering loyalties. Each revelation was less about passion than about leverage. Francesco's infidelity mattered less than its visibility, and Lucrezia wielded that visibility like a blade. For Alfonso, the betrayal might have stung another man, but he had long since abandoned illusions of romance in favour of partnership. He recognised what his wife had learned: surveillance and scandal could be inverted, used not as shackles but as weapons. When the news reached him, he did not rage. He simply remarked, "My wife has mastered the game." It was a marriage not of innocence, but of equals, each understanding that bodies could serve as currency in a market where silence was rare and memory long. With this affair, Lucrezia completed her transformation. She was no longer the girl bartered across courts, no longer the widow weeping in bloodied chambers, no longer the duchess forced to prove her union under watchful eyes. She had seized the mechanism itself. By controlling when, where, and how her intimacies were revealed, she turned scandal into shield, exposure into strategy. What her enemies had once used to humiliate her, she now weaponized against them. Sexuality had ceased to be merely survival. In Lucrezia's hands it became political leverage, a tool as sharp and enduring as any sword forged in Alfonso's workshops. The Duchess of Ferrara had learned to mint her own currency, and in doing so she ensured that her story would never again be written solely by the witnesses in the shadows. The years that followed did not yield the fairy tale of court poets, nor the tragedy whispered by enemies. Instead, the marriage of Alfonso d'Este and Lucrezia Borgia settled into something stranger and in its way stronger. Their union was not built on rapture or trust, but on recognition. Two survivors who had endured humiliation, blood, and suspicion, and who now understood that partnership could be sturdier than passion. Lucrezia bore Alfonso 7 children. Some lived to carry on the Este line. Many did not, their brief lives extinguished in infancy, as if echoing the fragility of the marriage itself. Each pregnancy carried risk, her body still weakened from the trauma of her first childbirth. Miscarriages and fevers stalked her chambers, and whispers persisted that the triple consummation had damaged her capacity forever. Yet each time she emerged scarred but unbroken, she reminded her enemies that endurance itself was power. What bound her and Alfonso was not romance but parity. He was no troubadour prince, but an engineer with cannon smoke on his clothes, a man who measured the world in angles and trajectories. She was no sheltered duchess, but a woman who had learned that her body could be weapon and shield, and that memory was more dangerous than any sword. Together they formed a marriage that baffled their contemporaries, less a union of hearts than of strategies, yet one that endured when other alliances collapsed. Court chroniclers noted the oddness of their intimacy. Alfonso tolerated her calculated affairs, recognizing them as instruments of leverage rather than betrayals. Lucrezia accepted his absences in the forge, and on campaign knowing his true loyalty lay in preserving Ferrara's independence. They did not pretend to a love story. Instead, they built a fortress of pragmatism brick by brick until Ferrara stood as one of the most resilient states in Italy. And yet beneath the steel of their partnership there was something more subtle. Those who watched closely observed the small gestures, the way Alfonso touched her, hand in counsel, absent-minded but steady. The way Lucrezia defended his decisions with a loyalty sharper than courtly flattery. They did not speak of love, but they acted in concert as though two instruments tuned by ordeal into unlikely harmony. Their alliance became legend, not because it was tender, but because it was durable. In a world where dynasties collapsed under the weight of suspicion, where marriages fractured into scandal, the strange partnership of Alfonso and Lucrezia outlasted rumour. What began with humiliation in the bedchamber evolved into a model of survival in the council chamber. It was not romance, but it was power, and it was enough. By the time the echoes of her wedding night had faded into myth, Lucrezia Borgia was no longer simply the Pope's daughter, or the infamous bride who had endured 3 consummations under watchful eyes. In Ferrara she became something rarer, a duchess who ruled not only by birthright but by intellect. Her past could not be erased. Rome still whispered her name with scandal. Pamphleteers still painted her as poisoner and seductress, but in Ferrara she discovered how to alchemize that infamy into authority. The city itself was her stage. Ferrara, smaller than Florence or Venice, could not rival their wealth or naval power, but under Alfonso and Lucrezia it became a cultural jewel. The court glittered with poets, painters and musicians whom Lucrezia welcomed with deliberate care. She extended patronage to Ludovico Ariosto, whose Orlando Furioso would become one of Italy's greatest epics. She surrounded herself with humanists and scholars, transforming her court into a place where letters and learning softened the iron edges of politics. By investing in beauty, she reshaped her image, not Lucrezia the scandal, but Lucrezia the patron, the cultured duchess whose taste and generosity ennobled her city. Diplomacy became her other domain. Alfonso often travelled for war, inspecting cannon foundries or leading campaigns. And in his absence, it was Lucrezia who received envoys who weighed petitions, who balanced Ferrara's fragile place between papal states Venice and France. Observers who once expected to see a frivolous papal pawn instead found a woman whose composure steadied negotiations. Her correspondence survives letters written with clarity and grace, revealing a political mind both shrewd and humane. She knew how to flatter, how to soothe, how to delay. She could disarm suspicion not by denying her past, but by wielding it, for that was her true weapon and scandalous armour. Where another woman might have wilted under rumour, Lucrezia turned infamy into insulation. Enemies called her corrupt. She smiled and governed effectively. They accused her of seduction. She replied with alliances that kept Ferrara safe. Having been accused of every imaginable sin, incest, adultery, murder, she became untouchable, for nothing new could shock. The worst had already been said, and so liberated from the fear of reputation, she acted boldly, carving out a role that few women of her century could achieve. In Ferrara's chronicles, she was no longer merely the daughter of a Borgia pope. She was La Duchessa, the woman who anchored a precarious state, who filled its halls with music and poetry, and who turned her own legend into political capital. The scandal followed her like a shadow, but shadows lengthen only where there is light, and in Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia shone with the authority of survival transfigured into grace. For centuries, the story of Lucrezia Borgia's wedding night existed only in rumour. Poets embroidered it, pamphleteers twisted it into satire, and her enemies turned it into proof of corruption. But the actual records, the words of the men who stood in the antechamber with quills poised, vanished from view. Francesco Castello's notarized parchments, Ludovico Cari's clinical observations, Bernardino da Prosperi's spy reports, all sealed, archived, and quietly buried in the labyrinth of Vatican vaults. The silence was deliberate. Even in an age when Rome tolerated poisonings and papal mistresses, some things were too compromising to preserve in daylight. To admit that the Church had sanctioned a marriage proven by triple consummation, witnessed and notarized, was to reveal the machinery of faith entangled with flesh. Better to let rumour reign than to preserve truth that reeked of bureaucratized intimacy. And so the documents slept. They survived dynasties, wars, and reformations, hidden in cabinets where labels faded and bindings crumbled. Generations passed, and the scandal of Lucrezia became legend, reshaped by writers who preferred melodrama to minutiae. She was cast as the she-wolf of Rome, the seductress, the poisoner, images far more entertaining than parchments filled with timestamps and notes on stained linens. It was not until the 1990s that scholars combing through long-neglected holdings unearthed the bundle. Dust fell from the bindings, wax seals cracked like bones under pressure. What they found was not debauchery, not a chronicle of lust or sin, but something far colder: bureaucracy. The notary's precise script marking 1247, the act commenced. The physician's detached notes, bride responsive groom, vigorous evidence preserved. The spy's commentary, half gossip, half report, they laughed together as if conspiring. The rediscovery was startling not for its obscenity but for its orderliness. Here was intimacy reduced to procedure, turned into proof through the machinery of law and medicine. The marriage bed transformed into a filing system. Far from confirming the wildest rumours, the documents revealed something more unsettling: the systematic conversion of human passion into political paperwork. For 500 years, the truth had been too dangerous to confront. But when democracy replaced dynasty, when scandal no longer toppled states, but merely filled tabloids, the Vatican's silence cracked. Scholars published the records, and the world looked again at Lucrezia Borgia, not as myth, but as case study. Not the femme fatale of Renaissance propaganda, but the unwilling protagonist of history's most invasive bureaucracy. In that rediscovery lay the true horror, not the sex itself, but the system that demanded it, documented it, and filed it away like evidence of a transaction. For 5 centuries, the papers had slept. When they awoke, they revealed less about lust than about power. The story of Lucrezia Borgia's wedding night does not linger because of its salaciousness, though that is what pamphleteers preferred. It endures because it exposes the naked mechanics of Renaissance power. In an age when treaties could dissolve with a single rumour of impotence, the most intimate act became the most public proof. The marriage bed meant to be sanctuary was transformed into negotiation table. Bodies became treaties written in flesh, not ink. For women, this was battlefield. Lucrezia's body was bartered like territory, inspected like property demanded as collateral. Every act of hers carried political weight. Annulled unions became defeats. Childbirths became fragile victories. Miscarriages turned into liabilities. To survive such a system required not innocence, but calculation. And she learned faster than most that silence and submission offered no safety. To endure was to weaponize what others sought to exploit. In this, Lucrezia lived a paradox, both victim and strategist. She did not choose the terms of her wedding night, yet she managed them with composure that unsettled even her watchers. She did not seek scandal, yet when scandal followed her, like a shadow she sharpened it into armour. To her enemies she was forever the poisoned bride. To Ferrara she became a capable duchess. Survival in her hands became something more, a lessening control in turning the mechanisms of humiliation back upon those who wielded them. The Borgia Protocol revealed how power devoured privacy. It showed that dynasties demanded proof not of affection, but of function fertility as coin sex, as contract intimacy, as spectacle. And yet Lucrezia's story also shows the fissures in that system. Even under the quills of notaries, even beneath the gaze of spies, fragments of humanity slipped through. Laughter shared in exhaustion, encouragement whispered in darkness. A marriage that against all odds evolved into partnership. It is tempting to remember only the brutality of the system, the way bodies were reduced to evidence. But to stop there is to deny Lucrezia's agency. She endured because she adapted, and she adapted because she recognized what her world demanded of her. She paid its price in blood and dignity, yet she also bent its weapons into tools of her own. The politics of the body is never abstract. It is lived in scars and breath, in the fragile lines between survival and subjugation. Lucrezia Borgia embodied both. She was the battlefield and the general, the victim and the strategist. And it is precisely in that contradiction that her story remains unsettling even today. When the witnesses finally set down their quills and sealed their parchments, the expectation had been that the record would preserve Lucrezia Borgia's humiliation for posterity. Yet Bernardino de Prosperi's private report to Isabella d'Este read differently. He did not describe a shamed bride broken under obligation. He described a woman who endured and, in enduring, transfigured the ritual into something else. Your brother, he wrote, has met his match in wit and in will. What was meant to subordinate has instead created partnership. That was the quiet revolution of that night. The Este family had demanded proof of fertility, Rome had demanded security, and history had demanded spectacle. But what emerged from those hours was not merely a marriage notarized in sweat and ink. It was the revelation that endurance itself could be authority. To withstand what would destroy others was in its own way to command. For Lucrezia this became her signature. Not beauty, though she had it. Not scandal, though it clung to her. Not wealth, though her dowry bought half of Ferrara's artillery. Her true currency was survival. She survived annulment by orchestrating her husband's public disgrace. She survived assassination by transforming widowhood into resilience. She survived childbirth that nearly killed her. And she survived the most invasive marriage contract of her century, not only intact but redefined as equal partner to a duke. Endurance became her power, and power became her refuge. In a world that sought to break her, she learned to bend. In a court that demanded silence, she learned to speak through strategy. In a dynasty that treated her body as battlefield, she learned to weaponize it on her own terms. The triple consummation of 1502 was meant to prove her compliance to bind her body in bureaucratic chains. Instead, it revealed a capacity for fortitude that outlived her witnesses, her husband, and even her enemies. Where others saw shame, she found leverage. Where others sought to record her subjugation, she scripted her endurance into legacy. This was Lucrezia Borgia's true transformation. Not the virgin bride, not the femme fatale of propaganda, but the duchess who discovered that to outlast is to rule. In the end, endurance was not merely survival, it was sovereignty. The dawn that broke over Ferrara on February 3rd, 1502, did not end with the exhausted silence of a marriage proven. It began the afterlife of a scandal that would ripple far beyond Lucrezia Borgia's chamber walls. What had been demanded in desperation by the Este family, 3 consummations witnessed and notarized, took on a strange life of its own, reshaping custom, contract, and culture across Europe. Courts whispered, then imitated. In France, where annulments had embarrassed dynasties, lawyers quietly inserted clauses into marriage contracts requiring ocular or auditory confirmation of completion. In the German states, bishops adapted canon law to emphasize the need for verifiable consummation no matter how intrusive. Even in Spain, whose royal court prided itself on severity, the idea seeped. In the proof of marriage was no longer trust or sacrament, but flesh transformed into record. Over time, this practice, half ritual, half paranoia, became normalized. The Borgia model, as detractors called it, was less about lust than about litigation. It was the systematization of doubt. Noble houses weary of annulment sought certainty, and so intimacy became procedure sealed with signatures and stains. What began as extraordinary humiliation hardened into bureaucratic tradition. Its echoes reached literature as well. Poets and playwrights seized upon the imagery, the wedding bed as courtroom, the sheets as evidence, the lover's sighs twisted into testimony. Scandal made good copy, and the Borgia name, already notorious, became shorthand for corruption hidden beneath ceremony. Yet even as writers embellished, the underlying truth remained. Dynasties had learned to codify intimacy to bureaucratize the bedroom. By the mid-16th century, entire generations of nobles grew up assuming this was normal. A bride's privacy was no longer hers. A groom's prowess was not a matter of rumour but of record. Behind every alliance lay parchment signed in ink and sheets preserved like relics. It was a legacy more enduring than any papal bull or battlefield treaty, the reduction of human bodies to instruments of statecraft. And still the name attached to it lingered. Not Este, not Castello, the notary, not Cari, the physician. It was Borgia, because scandal sticks not to those who demand but to those who endure. Lucrezia's night of 3 consummations became legend not for Alfonso's engineering pragmatism, nor for the Este family's paranoia, but because it bore the mark of her name, a name already blackened by rumour, now immortalized by ritual. Thus the afterlife of her scandal was not limited to gossip. It entered the legal codes, the contracts, the literature of Europe. From Ferrara to France, from Mantua to Madrid, the Borgia model lingered like a ghost in parchment. A scandal turned into system, a humiliation into heritage, a single night into centuries of practice. 500 years have passed since Lucrezia Borgia's bedchamber became a tribunal, yet the mechanisms that stripped her privacy feel disturbingly familiar. What her witnesses represented, surveillance, verification, exposure, are the very forces that define our own age. Where Renaissance notaries and physicians leaned at doors with quills today, cameras blink red in every corner. Files are time-stamped with digital precision, and private moments leak into public arenas judged by audiences no less hungry than the courtiers of Ferrara. The obsession is the same proof. Just as the Este family demanded notarized consummation to secure their alliance, modern institutions demand documentation before granting trust. Security cameras confirm innocence, phone records establish alibis, intimate videos are weaponized to validate or destroy reputations. The tools have changed ink, replaced by pixels, parchment by servers, but the principle endures. Privacy becomes collateral, sacrificed to guarantee legitimacy. And just as Lucrezia learned to bend scandal into strategy, today's figures, politicians, celebrities, even ordinary people must navigate exposure as both risk and opportunity. A leaked recording can ruin a career, or it can be spun into authenticity, proof that someone is real in ways carefully staged performances never achieved. The blurred line between humiliation and authority that defined Lucrezia's ordeal remains alive in an era where audiences demand both spectacle and sincerity. Consider the continuity of performance. Renaissance witnesses leaned close for audible gasps. Now millions scroll and replay, dissecting gestures frame by frame. Then as now, the body becomes text interpreted endlessly, its meaning less about private truth than public narrative. A contract sealed by sheets in 1502 finds its echo in careers sealed or destroyed by viral footage today. We comfort ourselves by imagining progress, yet the resonance is clear. The court of Ferrara has become the court of a public opinion, global and instantaneous. The marriage bed has been replaced by the digital feed, but the exchange is the same intimacy traded for credibility, dignity, mortgaged for proximity to power. This is the unsettling inheritance of the Borgia protocol, that audiences across centuries continue to demand performance, and that survival still depends on mastering the terms of exposure. Dawn rose cold over Ferrara on February 3rd, 1502. The city still slept, its revellers collapsed after a night of feasting, unaware that in one chamber the real alliance had already been forged. Inside, the air was heavy with wine, sweat, and wax. Sheets lay bundled like relics, stained and sealed, waiting to be filed in archives. 3 witnesses stepped out into the corridor, their parchments tucked beneath their arms, their expressions dazed. They had not merely recorded a marriage, they had documented a trial of flesh transformed into treaty. On the bed, Lucrezia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este or Cito lay entangled not in passion but in exhaustion, their bodies pressed together by necessity and sheer endurance. What had begun as humiliation had ended as something more complicated. They had performed what others demanded, but they had done it as partners, whispering encouragement through fatigue, even laughing through pain. And in that unlikely solidarity they discovered the foundation of their strange enduring marriage. The 3 consummations became legend not for their scandal, but for what they symbolized: the reduction of intimacy into statecraft, the transformation of bodies into documents, the proof of dynasties extracted from private breath. Flesh became treaty, performance became archive stone. And yet within that spectacle, endurance, quiet, stubborn human emerged as its own legacy. The lesson is stark and enduring. Power always demands a price. For Lucrezia, the price was her body witnessed and notarized, her privacy surrendered to the ambitions of men. For us, the currencies may differ, data, reputation, exposure, but the principle remains. Authority feeds on intimacy, legitimacy is purchased with proof, and survival is measured in what we are willing to yield. But dignity lies not in refusing the demand, for few in history have been granted that luxury. Dignity lies in shaping the exchange and deciding how the price will be paid. Lucrezia did not choose her circumstances, but she chose how to endure them. She turned scandal into armour, humiliation into leverage, endurance into sovereignty. As the first light washed the towers of Ferrara, the city saw only a duchess and her new duke bound by law and sacrament. But history remembers something deeper: that behind the oak door in the long hours between midnight and dawn, 2 people discovered the most subversive truth of all, that survival itself can be power, and that even under the harshest gaze, dignity endures when you claim the terms of your own story. History often hides its deepest lessons in the most unsettling corners. The story of Lucrezia Borgia's wedding night in 1502, 3 consummations witnessed, recorded, notarized, might appear to us as lurid scandal, a grotesque spectacle of humiliation. But when we strip away the shock, what remains is not a tale of debauchery. It is a mirror held up to power, showing how authority consumes privacy, how survival requires resilience, and how dignity can endure even under impossible demands. The Este family insisted on proof because they feared weakness. They wanted more than promises or parchment. They wanted evidence stamped in blood and breath that their alliance was real. And in that demand we see a timeless truth: when trust collapses, systems turn invasive. In Lucrezia's world, this meant midwives and notaries crouched outside her chamber. In ours, it may mean surveillance cameras, background checks, or the endless demands for receipts and documentation. Power always insists on proof, but the lesson does not end in cynicism. What Lucrezia teaches us is how to survive when the price is extracted. She could not refuse her father's bargain or silence the Este demands. What she could do was endure, and in enduring transform the narrative. The witnesses expected to see submission. Instead, they recorded partnership. They anticipated humiliation. Instead, they found solidarity between 2 people who laughed through exhaustion and whispered encouragement in the dark. Endurance became not defeat, but quiet triumph. That is the first lesson for us. Survival itself can be a form of power. Life often imposes demands that feel invasive, degrading, or unjust. We cannot always prevent those demands, but we can control how we meet them, whether we collapse under their weight or use them to forge resilience that others cannot erase. The second lesson lies in the transformation of scandal into armour. Lucrezia's reputation was already poisoned by rumour, incest, murder, intrigue. Rather than attempting the impossible task of cleansing her name, she embraced it. If she was to be accused of everything, she would wield that notoriety as shield. In our own world, where reputations are easily tainted by gossip, social media, or public judgment, we too can learn from her pragmatism. What is said about you does not have to define you. Sometimes it can even be repurposed into strength. Finally, her life reminds us that dignity is not the absence of compromise, but the manner in which we choose to compromise. Few of us control the terms of every bargain we face, but we can decide the spirit with which we endure them. Lucrezia chose partnership over humiliation, resilience over collapse agency over victimhood. The dawn that broke over Ferrara in 1502 revealed more than stained sheets and sealed parchments. It revealed a truth that transcends centuries. Power always demands a price, but dignity lies in choosing how you pay it. And in that choice, in the quiet, unyielding act of endurance, we discover the kind of strength that outlasts scandal, rumour, and even time itself. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.